We are.
The floor is yours, Alberto.
Cheers. Hello everyone, thank you to be here, the opportunity to be here today. According to tradition, the basis of Jewish legal system, there are two main codes, the laws of Noah and the laws of Moses. Both originated from the majesty of divine mandate. However, as the biblical period drew to a close, Moses' law underwent an evolution that justifies its description as both natural and divine. Rabbis often say that God presented Moses with not just one law, but two on Mount Sinai. These two laws comprise the written law, the Torah, and an unwritten law that God directly imparted to Moses. The unwritten law was then transmitted to Moses to Joshua, from Joshua to the elders of Israel, and the rabbis themselves passing through the generations. Rabbis then claim that the content of this unwritten law can be uncovered through the examination of the written law. Therefore, it was only through human reasoning that the complete revelation of Mount Sinai can be understood. In Jewish tradition, so natural law in this sense served as a tool to unveil the will of God. This natural law, as the rabbis intended it, was then put in the Talmud, in the legal codes, and in the writings of countless scholars and rabbis. If the Mosaic codes, or the Mosaic laws, hold significance for those who accepted it through the covenant established by Israel with God himself, the Noahide code, on the other hand, appears to possess a universal nature. The Talmud also includes the idea that the covenant between God and Noah sets out a limited array of universal rules and morals, originally given to Adam and therefore applicable to all human groups, regardless nation or race. In this regard, medieval Rabbi Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon in Hebrew, individuated a non-Jews commitment to pre-revelational laws into Noachic laws. From the Jewish point of view, the Noachic laws serve as the fundamental set of requirements for any human society. In other words, the Noachic laws are a list of 7 moral imperatives which, according to the Talmud, once again, were given to by God to Noah as a binding set of laws for all mankind. And this is the exegesis of the Genesis chapter 9. So, essentially, the Jewish tradition of natural law is quite complex and led across multiple levels of interpretation. One way to interpret the Jewish categorization is by considering the inner tension between the legitimacy of legal norms that originate from sources other than the divine, the godly law, which was revealed to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai, and a corpus of pre-Mosaic laws, or a pre-Mosaic codes. So, Jewish sources uphold a kind of universal elements to the law, acknowledging the presence of pre-revelational laws and showing respect for those who follow them, considering them as the righteous among the nations, of course. All that being said, several prominent figures in the 17th century discourse on the law of nature made extensive references to Jewish sources. In thinking about law governing states and people, 17th century scholars referred not just to natural law, Roman law, and the positive law of the various states, but also to the Jewish tradition as it arose from the readings of the Bible and post-biblical rabbinic sources. They thought Noachic laws were the most accurate expression of natural law. Just to name a few, Hugo Grotius, John Selden, Samuel Pufendorf, and even Alberico Gentili, took Hebrew sources into consideration when they mused on natural law. To date, many scholars have contended that the Jewish references were not a simple superficial addition, but rather invoked a doctrine of Hebraica veritas, Jewish truth, seeking solution to the political and legal challenges of the time within Jewish texts. This kind of scholars, 17th century scholars, set out to construct a political doctrine extending beyond the traditional Catholic doctrines of medieval scholasticism, of the 17th century Spanish scholasticism, of course, that saw the roots of natural law in the Ten Commandments. Here we are. In short, early church fathers, such Irenaeus, Justin, Ambrose, Tertullian, believed that the Ten Commandments in the Pentateuch were fully embraced in the New Testament. This implied that these commandments were considered part of natural law within Christian theology. Aquinas, in particular, identified the Ten Commandments with natural love itself, teaching that the Decalogue contains, at least implicitly, all the conclusions more or less deduced from natural life. So, medieval law philosophy looked at the Ten Commandments as an ethic response valid to all. First to pose this notion was Duns Scotus, that claimed that natural law all includes that what impresses itself with the force of evidence upon all beings who are endowed with reason and will. Although Duns Scotus was not well versed in Hebrew or rabbinic studies, and did not make any reference to Jewish sources, it is still intriguing to know the initial hint of change. This doubt manifested again when Grotius and John Selden in England, rejected the idea that Decalogue and natural law were the same. Now, to address the main topic of my brief contribution, both Grotius and Selden replaced the Decalogue with the Talmudic idea of Noachic laws and the 7 commandments that were mentioned in the books of the Babylonian Talmud. I believe this is a remarkable substitution given the more than 1,000-year tradition of Christian hostility to the Talmud, or the Talmud, the books of the supposed evilness of the Jews, filled with all the Jewish errors and, blasphemous fables. So, ranging from the Talmud, Grotius claimed that Decalogue was specifically for the Jews and contained commandments relevant only to the Jewish or the Israelite people, like Shabbat observance. In contrast, the Noachic laws were seen as more general, universal, applicable to all humanity before the Mount Sinai revelation. A close reading of the Rebelliac pages reveals Grotius' position, who claimed that a divine voluntary law was, and this is a quotation, was given either to all mankind or to one people, that is, both to Gentiles and Jews. Grotius seeks to establish a general law of nature consisting of a highly concise set of principles that logically derive from self-evident belief about the world and natural life, of course. Nowhere in his book, Grotius proclaims that Decalogue is the expression of natural law and mandatory for all humanity, as it was very common at the time, since, generally speaking, the law of Moses obliged only the Israelites. Hebrew law, or the law of the Torah, therefore does not represent natural law, even though it is not in opposition to it. In this condition, Grotius believed that there was nothing else in the divine law announced on Mount Sinai to the Hebrews that concerned the rest of humanity. Here are some summary of this topic. So the evidence for this is that Grotius in the Iure Belli talks about people from other nations who are considered pious or righteous. Can I change? May I change? Okay. This is a quotation of Grotius, the Jure Pagis. On this topic, Grotius correctly mentions a Hebrew expression, Chasideu mot haolam, that means righteous among nations, and say that these people, as rabbis state, were supposed to follow the rules given to Adam and Noah. That is, not worshipping idols, not consuming blood, not sacrificing human, and so on. Grotius also mentions that these laws, or as he calls them, praecepta noachidarum, were given to all people, all humanity, at 3 different times. First, right after humans were created, then after the flood, and finally through the Gospels in a more perfect way. Is then clear the rabbinic influence of Grotius' conception of a divine universal positive law, since according to Grotius himself, and as rabbis always say, this universal law is a perpetual obligation, firstly promulgated immediately after the creation of man. On the other hand, English jurist John Selden took up Grotius' ideas systematically in defending the notion, the line that the Noachic laws, and not the Decalogue, provide the basic principle for any society, both legally and morally speaking. Indeed, the 7 books is De Jure Naturali et Gentium Iuxta Disciplinam Hebreorum correspond to the 7 Noachic laws and are an immense elaboration of the rabbinic thought. For example, the last 2 chapters in the first book discuss how Noachic law is seen as the law ordered by God, and how the Jews understand it as the laws followed by the descendants of Noah, with the 7 basic rules. Also, Selden demonstrates each time that the law being examined in one of his books is one of the fundamental principles of natural law itself, and that anything considered part of natural law is encompassed within one of these Noachic laws. Selden is really good at it, and it shows impressive skills, almost like what you find in the Talmud itself. This because Selden uses a wide array of rabbinic writings, including the medieval rabbi Maimonides, and all I won't see them, all the obscure medieval rabbis from Spain and Italy. He constantly cites, for example, Maimonides' Alach Meikshe Korbanot and Alach Bita Bechera, that are among the most obscure writings of the medieval rabbi. Another thing to consider is that Grotius and Selden saw the connection between natural law and divine revelation. On one hand, Grotius says that everything is, he has considered would still apply even if we were to suppose that there is no God, or that God doesn't care about human matters. And he says also that the law of nature is so fixed that even God himself cannot alter it. Selden, on the other hand, takes a straightforward approach to the concept of natural law, which develops directly from the Noachic laws. He firmly believes that the teachings found in the Talmud or in the rabbinic writings regarding the Noachic laws are the complete expression of natural laws. In a sense, Selden doesn't portray these laws as something discovered by human reason or human brain, as Grotius does. Instead, he sees them as universal applicable principle, since these laws are revelation from God himself. Here we go, some quotation by Selden. Selden, like Grotius, in this case, believes that although some principles may seem to be logically necessary, they in the end come from God because it was his choice for this principle to exist. With the aid of commentaries on specific verses from the Biblia Rabbinica, Selden expands upon Grotius' ideas and demonstrates that Job adhered to Noachic laws. For evidence, he referenced Job chapter 31, where Job resists to the allure of the sun and the moon, showing that he does not worship foreign deities. The expression Selden uses, children of Noah, is in this sense a technical term, technical expression, denoting all the people before the revelation at Sinai and all non-Jews who, ipso facto, did not accept Mosaic laws of the Torah after the revelation on Mount Sinai to Moses. In the end, there is no universal law except the one revealed by God himself, or Selden, in other words, follows a concept of law based on the will of a superior authority, which is quite different from what we typically expect from a natural law thinker. Only the command of a higher authority, as God, can create and enforce the law. And to do this, he uses a wide range of crucial sources in the Jewish tradition. These include the books of the Bible, like the Pentateuch, prophets, Psalms, and he also refers to various Talmudic treatises like Gittin, Terumoth, as well as the writings of biblical commentators like Rashi, 11th century, Ibn Ezra, 12th century, Bechai, 13th, 14th century, and even pure Talmudists and rabbis such as Maimonides, 12th century, Moses of Kosi, 1st century, Rabbeinu Nissim, 14th century, Ovadia Bertinoro, 15th century, and Yom Tom of Seville. All these names, I'm quite sure you don't know them, were rather unknown in general culture, but all the great names of the Jewish tradition and the way Selden cited them support an argument of the nature of the status of natural law as an impressive work of reelaboration of Jewish sources and Talmudic and rabbinic sources. That's because Selden, as the main Hebraist in 17th century England, had a strong interest in Jewish sources and a deep understanding of their content, which wasn't probably matched by anyone else afterward. 17th century, as is widely known, saw the groundbreaking unfolding of Hebrew studies and Hebrew sources, and the emergence of a political ideology prompted by a return to Jewish sources. Therefore, also the argumentation method of Grotius, and Selden, of course, rooted in the biblical heritage, in the so-called Christian Hebraism, aimed at the reshaping of the perspectives of legal scholarship, theology, philosophy, all regarding the key political and religious issues of the time. This kind of resurgence of Hebrew scholarship in the 17th century had then a deep impact, altering the scope of arguments available to European scholars of the time. Christian and political Hebraism, that not Judaism. Hebraism is not Judaism. Hebraism is a scholarship, is a reelaboration of the political ideas these authors thought were present in the Jewish sources. So Hebraism is not Judaism. I would say political Hebraism, Christian Hebraism, introduced arguments previously unknown to early generations of political theorists by elevating positions that were previously considered disreputable to a newfound level of respectability. However, what set this revival apart as something that most only heard in the history of Christianity was its incorporation of a significant portion of rabbinic Jewish tradition into almost every discourse. So, as we have seen, this tradition includes references and authorities ranging from the two Talmuds and the codes of the Jewish law to medieval Jewish scholars like Rashi, Ibn Ezra, as I said before, and even 17th century figures such Leone da Modena, and Menasseh ben Israel. This was made possible by the growth of Jewish studies in all the great European universities and the emergence of the idea that Hebrew was as vital as Latin and Greek for serious study of law or philosophy. As a matter of fact, both Grotius and Selden were typical trilingual scholars. They knew Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Indeed, after being translated into Latin, the text from the Jewish tradition became embraced by all these figures, and we're talking about people like Thomas Hobbes, James Harrington, John Milton, John Locke, and of course Selden and Hugo Grotius. This allowed them to incorporate the biblical and rabbinic heritage in their own words, and it's not a coincidence that the blossoming of these studies took place in politically stable environments such as the Dutch United Provinces, which during the 80 Years' Wars became the first European republic, or for example during the English Revolution, when supporters of Cromwell, as Selden himself, were quite prone to reference to a wide array of rabbinic degrees, suggesting that these kings and the kings, all the kings, could be judged and even punished if they're guilty of committing crimes. This movement, based on the rediscovery of Jewish sources, led toward the so-called Hebraica Veritas and spawned a foundational republican and anti-monarchist myth in European thought, that of the Res Publica Hebreorum, the Commonwealth of the Jews, an ideal political entity constructed not only on the basis of biblical texts, but also from specifically Jewish sources and the later rabbinic writings, such as the Maimonides, Mishneh Torah. In conclusion, the transition made by Grotius, albeit cautiously and seldom in a forthright manner, from a reliance of the Decalogue and scholasticism to an engagement with the Talmud, and generally speaking the rabbinic sources, was undeniably a remarkable development. This shift in the approach not only demonstrates a willingness to explore a broad range of sources and ideas, but also underscore the recognition of the value of the Jewish tradition as a source of wisdom and knowledge that could enrich their scholarship. Grotius and Selden were thinking a natural law from the Noachic Code and the incorporating the Jewish legal and political tradition into the scholarly discourse not only expanded the horizons of political and legal thought, but also served as a testament, as a real testament to the evolving nature of intellectual exploration in 17th century. In both Christianity and Judaism, the Mosaic law outlined in the Old Testament serves as dividing border. This eventually explains why both Grotius and Selden hold a more favorable view of the rabbinic tradition of the Noachic law. Thank you.
For having me, and secondly, a quick disclaimer. What's happening in the movie The Mission is actually happening a century or even a century and a half later than what I'm going to explain. So it's not the same context, even though the music is great. So in this presentation, I will start with contextualization, because the events themselves are quite interesting, and then I will talk about the natural right perspective and the influence these Jesuits are using in their justification. So the Jesuit province of Paraguay, which covers an area much larger than the present-day state, was founded in 1609. Jesuits from the Spanish possession began evangelizing the Guaranis far from the Spanish outposts of the Rio de la Plata. Spain, then benefiting from the union with Portugal, delegated to the missionaries the task of occupying these frontiers claimed by both Spaniards and Portuguese. The first 3 decades of the Jesuit experience in Paraguay were punctuated by tragedy, but also by a rapid success. Some tribes were hostile, but the missionaries were generally well received. The real danger came from the Portuguese colonies in Brazil, where the sugar industry was booming. The plantations were hungry for slaves, and the bandeirantes, or the slave hunters, of Sao Paulo had to go further and further to capture indigenous people. So while the encounter between Spanish Jesuits and Portuguese slave hunters from Sao Paulo took place as early as the foundation of the province, it was the Jesuit evangelization of the Guaira region, perfectly equidistant between Asunción and Sao Paulo, that upset the precarious balance between the Spanish and the Portuguese on the frontier. The slave hunters were surprised to find large numbers of Guaranis in the defenseless reductions. Year after year, the malocas, so the razzias, the raids, became more frequent, the captive more numerous, and the banderas better organized. So between 1628 and 1631, approximately 5,000 of Guaranis were captured. Faced with such a disaster, the Jesuits decided in 1631 to organize a massive displacement of the population, but it was a complete failure. And the Paulist Malocas did not see this. So they reached actually a climax in the years 1630, 1640, with increasingly frequent mention of the bandeirantes within the letters and the literary arbor. And faced with the multiple disasters and the indigenous resistance that led to the gradual militarization of the missions, the Jesuits had to question their role in the conflicts they witnessed. Many were involved in the outpouring of violence. Most acted as priests and became chaplains, accompanying combatants in prayer, but a number of documents attest to the active participation of several missionaries of the Society of Jesuits in the battles between the Guaranis and the slave hunters. They decided to buy firearms, to organize troops, and command them in a battle. This phenomenon occurred much earlier, actually. So, an example in Uruguay, the provincial, the superior of the province, Diego de Boroa, sent Father Francisco de Astaño and 2 brothers to the mission of Jesus Maria. Diego de Boroa gave them full authority to purchase the necessary weapons and equipment on condition that they be used for defensive purpose. And they fortified and decided to protect the reduction until Spanish reinforcement arrived. Obviously, it was never the case. Another example of involvement in armed conflicts is the direct involvement in battles. For example, Pedro Romero and Pedro Romola armed themselves with muskets and held the trenches. They were wounded in the fighting. So while in many reductions took up arms and led militias, Jesuit authorities in the province were torn between advocates of armed defense and supporters of Spanish intervention, which obviously was slow, even impossible to materialize. It was against this backdrop that in 1637 a provincial congregation was held. So this is an assembly of the province principal superiors, and they met to discuss major issues, made decisions, and informed the Superior General in Rome. So obviously in 1637, the survival of the reduction was the major issue. militias were formed by arming and instructing the indigenous Guaranis. Reduction would be fortified and forges built. That was the main decision taken. However, neither Rome nor Madrid approved these initiatives and made this well known. So despite this clear disapprobation, the Jesuit province of Paraguay decided to enter into a collective disobedience and obviously has now to explain and justify this new trajectory. So in this enterprise of justification, the discursive arsenal is dominated by the mobilization of the notion, or by a notion or notions of natural rights, as understood by the Spanish Jesuit of the time. This legal, moral, theological concept was to permeate the Jesuits' writing. Among themselves, they used it to convince themselves of the rightness of their actions. In memorandums, they used it to explain and above all justify their decisions. The aim was to justify the policy of armed defense of the province, but also the priest participation in combat, or the supply of firearms to the Guaranis. The supply of firearms to indigenous people is completely forbidden in the Spanish empires. So natural rights are the cornerstone of a highly complex argument that is connected to casuistic examples and theological references. It's also about justifying a phenomenon of massive disobedience, very rare within the highly disciplined company of Jesus. And finally, these debates bear witness of the difficulty of reconciling the natural rights of indigenous people with canon law on one hand and Spanish law on the other. So my main example will be a Jesuit memorandum of 1639 sent to the court of Madrid, namely the king, but obviously it's the Council of India. It was written by 7 Jesuits very involved in the defense policy in the province. So after the decisions taken within the provincial congregation, the internal dissension within the province was very important, and they had to also justify this disobedience to the kingdom, to the crown, and to the superior general in Rome. At the Madrid court, the Portuguese party or faction and other enemies of the Jesuits were quick to object to the Jesuits' involvement into the armed defense of Paraguay, while in the colony itself, the colonial authorities were very reluctant to arm distressed indigenous people. It was feared that these priest-led Guaranis militia would ravage Spanish cities and even invade Peru. So, in the face of such resistance, and in order to allay fears, refute slanders, win the king's support, these Jesuits wrote a plea, mainly justifying the need to arm, instruct, and guide the Guaranis in combat, as well as for the Jesuit fathers to get involved into the armed defense. Justifying, therefore, a royal edict, so it is forbidden to arm indigenous people, and a canonical interdict, royal interdict and a canonical interdict. It is illicit for a priest to fight or kill. However, numerous exceptions did exist, and the Jesuits' aim was to evoke the extreme gravity of the situation while recalling the inaction of Spanish troops in the region. They also made numerous guarantees that the Guaranis would remain under their control. But the heart of the argument is the primacy of natural rights over all else, especially those of the indigenous people, but also those of the Jesuits. They made the slanted plea calling on the church grades theology on their advantage. It was not the first time that Jesuits had mobilized the natural rights of their flock, the indigenous people, but until then they had claimed the right to property or subsistence, whereas here they were militating for their right to armed defense, notably by using European firearms. During numerous attacks, they saw how the Guaranis were outgunned by the Portuguese armed with arquebuses, and they thought only European weapons could bring victories. Finally, the aim was also to multiply the legal and moral arguments justifying the Jesuits' participation in the battles. According to the others, armed self-defense was an innate right of every person by virtue of natural and human rights. When it comes to defending one's life, honor, or land, it is therefore lawful to kill if one has no other choice. Indigenous people can also defend the freedom of their wives, children, land, fields, haciendas, or churches. For if they are taken captive, the Guaranis will soon meet their death on their way to the shores of Brazil or on the sugar cane plantations. Faced with these risks, the risk to their salvation, they have an obligation of conscience, as Luis de Molina wrote, and they must defend themselves. Without weapon to oppose the Bandeirantes, the salvation of their soul would therefore be at stake, which is obviously impossible to imagine. Faced with the risk of dying without confession and without spiritual help, of seeing the salvation of their souls slip through their hands, they have a moral obligation to defend themselves. This idea of the obligation to defend oneself by killing the enemy can also be found in the writings of Franciscus Bonet Spain. And moreover, as Gabriel Vasquez and Francisco de Torero stated, self-defense is an obligatory duty under penalty of mortal sin. Inevitably, natural rights and theological arguments intermingled, while the plea no longer mentioned a right but an obligation. The Jesuits were already obliged to teach doctrine, administer the sacraments, know the same obligation and are therefore required, on pain of mortal sin, to provide weapons to the Guaranis and instruct them in their handling, if they can do so without danger to themselves. It's another subtlety from Bonnet's writing. When another individual is threatened, his life must also be defended at the cost of temporal goods that are not necessary for one's life. Now, since armed defense appears to be an elementary natural right from which derives an obligation under penalty of mortal sin, the means of such a defense are just as important. For the Jesuits, no general or particular law of the kingdom or of the church could prohibit the Guaranis from using firearms in the context of their legitimate defense. For when an action is just, so too are the means of carrying it out. The cause justifies the means. And in this they again draw explanation from Bonnet and Molina. Thus, natural rights do not forbid the use of arms, but permit and order them by virtue of the just defense of life, country, and church, as has been mentioned before. And as for missionaries, even if positive law, il derecho positivo, forbids clerics to take up arms, this prohibition ceased in urgent and necessary cases, since natural law prevails over positive law for the just and necessary defense of the life and soul of self and others. If these Jesuits believed that there is no mortal sin in killing, but rather in not defending oneself, since this is a moral obligation, it's because at the same time, in the Tape and Uruguay reduction, several missionaries are taking up arms and leading indigenous troops into battle. So the aim was to justify a state of affairs, a current situation that had existed in Paraguay for at least 4 and 5 years. And in fact, the Bandeirantes attacks were more numerous and destructive than ever before, and the failure to resist simply meant abandoning entire regions and losing 3 decades of evangelization. Now I'm gonna I'm going to quickly mention the memorandum influences. So, to support their argument, the documents try to multiply examples of jurisprudence, and they cited numerous legal and theological references. Without presuming on the intellectual quality of these Jesuits, it is certain that the drafting of such a document required lengthy preparation, not forgetting that the documents were ultimately to be presented to the king, more likely to the Council of Indies, a body which was related by jurists. So, a first reference is to the Lex Cornelia de Iniuriis by the Roman dictator Sylla, probably cited for its ability to tolerate reaction to violent action. Then there is the obvious legal theological reference to Thomas Aquinas, which is everywhere in the document, and also to Marsilius of Padua, which is Gibelin, physician and philosopher who criticized Thomas Aquinas. Then, obviously, the Salamanca school. In addition to these, firstly, in addition to these figures, we also have Prospero Farinacci, which is an Italian criminal lawyer, Fernando Rebello, which is a Spanish Jesuit in favor of freeing slaves, so it's another reference, and Franciscus Bonespe, I mentioned it, a Carmelite theologian from Leuven, who wrote about Thomist and Thomistic principles. Salamanca school, briefly to conclude, obviously the Dominicans were mentioned, and so Dominicans Francisco de Victoria and Domingo de Soto, and the three Jesuits, Francisco de Toledo, Francisco Suarez, and Gabriel Vasquez, and Luis de Molina. In Luis de Molina's case, it was De Jure et Justitia, this political legal treatise was used and cited because it provides casuistic examples for authority figures, such as the Jesuits in Paraguay with regard to war and violence, and what natural rights authorized in this context. Conclusion, so to briefly resume everything, the Jesuits faced disastrous and dramatic situation, and the only option for them was to act against Spanish laws and orders from Rome, so they all entered into this very interesting collective disobedience. Because they had to justify what was happening in the whole region, they used moral, legal, and theological notion, rights, and obligation to defend oneself, life, family, country, church, property, as I mentioned, and others, with this penalty of mortal sin argument. They also mentioned the primacy of natural rights over anything else, and they used a lot of theological juridical references, mainly Thomas Aquinas and the Salamanca school. And I'm going to conclude here. Thank you.